Right, I think we should make a start. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for coming to this afternoon session of EAMS. My name is Chris Sangan. I'm chairing the session. We've got two very interesting talks this afternoon. Before we, let me just show you the programme. So we have the there we are, Tuesday afternoon. So the first talk this afternoon are two colleagues from University of Edinburgh, Dr. Stephen O'Hagan and Dr. George Kinnear, who will be talking about exam marking processes, marking exams online, which are our exam marking processes that we put into place in the last few months. And second, we'll have Chris Graham from University of Newcastle, who will also be talking about experiences with automatically marked first year exams. So just to remind everyone, please, before we get into the talks, of course, in the main EAMS website, for each session, we have this question forum. Please post your questions here. The big advantage of having the questions here is that those questions persist. Look, we've got questions from all these sessions. We can answer those questions asynchronously and it doesn't get lost in the chat. So please post your questions there and we can answer those in due course. And I will post a link to that so that you can find that easily enough. It's already been done. Thanks, Christian. Right, let's get started. Stephen, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Chris. And hi, everyone. Thanks for coming along. Let's start with an overview of this session. I'll say a few words about the context that we are operating in here at Edinburgh, and then I'll give a brief description of the process that we use to produce clear instructions about how to students about how to submit their exam scripts online. Then I'll hand over to George, who'll take you through the marking process that we used, and he'll compare three different tools that we used. And he'll end with some thoughts about how what we're planning to do in the next academic year. Okay, on to the context. Our university decided to cancel all exams for first and second years and to keep exams for everyone else. So for us, that meant running online exams for third, fourth and fifth year undergraduates, as well as taught postgraduate students. These were to be take-home open book exams to be done in a fixed time window. The time allowed for exams was as normal, but with an additional 1 hour allowed for preparing and uploading PDF submissions. And in addition, and crucially, there was a no detriment policy in place that meant, in essence, that a student's mark in an individual exam could not decrease their overall average. A key part of this whole process was ensuring that the exam scripts we received from students were in the format that we wanted. As George will mention later, our VLE is Blackboard, which doesn't allow a great deal of control over what students are allowed to submit. So it was very important for us to provide clear instructions to students about how to produce their PDF submission. We drafted step-by-step instructions for students and how to create and submit their PDF exam script. And these were trialed by colleagues before we ran a dummy exam process for all students. Doing this really enabled students to get confidence that they were doing the right thing before they took exams for real. And it enabled us to give feedback to students against a clear set of criteria. The guidance that we ended up producing for students and the set of criteria that we gave them feedback on their dummy exam submission are available in the Moodle site for this conference. So you can download and look at that guidance that we produced, and you can see the feedback that we gave to students. We were very fortunate to have help of postgraduate tutors to be able to provide that feedback to students and really give them the confidence that what they were going to do for real in exams was going to be the right thing. As I said, you can download that guidance that we did produce, This is the sort of thing that we were producing, very visual guidance for students and very clear instructions about what we were expecting of them. Once it came to the exams for real, because we were limited to having to use Blackboard, the only way we could allow students to undo any errors that they made when they submitted was to allow them to make unlimited number of submissions for each exam. So we did that, and the instructions made clear that we would take the last submission that the students made. We also put in place a backup submission form in case students had any difficulties using the Blackboard assignment submission. I'm going to hand over to George now, who will take you through the marking process. Oh, sorry, I need to stop sharing.
Can you hear me now? Right, thank you. So now that we've got all these students submitting their work online, it's over to us to do the marking. So the process that we went through was this kind of three-phase thing where the students had done their submission, so we needed to deal with all those PDFs that had been submitted. Then we needed to send them off for marking, and then we had to think about our moderation process. So I'll step through each of those stages of the process. And as Stephen mentioned, within the marking, we were trying out 3 different tools. So we'll go through those in detail. So starting with the submission, as Stephen said, we've got all these PDFs coming in to Learn. It's quite easy from there to download them all as a zip file. So we downloaded all the attempts because they may have submitted multiple times. And actually what we wanted to take was not their last attempt, but their last on-time attempt, because there was a deadline attached to this. And at this point also the student submissions are not anonymous, so we need to do some processing to make them anonymous files. So what you get from Learn is this zip file, and for each student you've got a receipt text file and you've also got their PDF. And fortunately they're named in a very systematic way. So these numbers here are our kind of non-anonymous student numbers, and we need to turn those into exam numbers. So we took a class list that was prepared by the teaching office, which also noted down any students that were entitled to extra time. This was a kind of wrinkle in the process that we didn't just have a firm deadline for everyone. Some people were entitled to some extra time. So we needed to go through the logic of all this and take out of this big zip file the correct PDF for each student. So I wrote some code to do that. It's just a little exe file which reads in all the folder and in the spreadsheet, and out of that you get a nice folder where each PDF is named with the student's exam number, which is the more sort of anonymous identifier that we use. So once we've done that, we're ready to do marking. And I should say that the code for doing that, if anyone ever needs to do this for themselves, it's all there on GitHub. I learned the Go programming language to do this and found it quite useful. So you can use that to compile code that will run on different platforms as well. Unfortunately, there was a bit of mopping up to do after this process because not all the students followed the rules. Fortunately, they were quite good at doing that. So I think the guidance that we put in place meant that most students knew what to do and did it correctly. But there were a handful of students who would, maybe in a panic, they weren't able to get the scanning working, but they were able to upload some JPEGs. So we did our best to make those work. They weren't fed through this process automatically, but we had to go through and kind of make a PDF on their behalf and feed it in. And there was also the backup submission form. So this was a Microsoft Forms thing. That was mainly there because we wanted to avoid students panicking if there was some problem with Learn and sending us lots of emails with PDFs and things attached. So we wanted a clear backup route that could be used. And a nice feature of this is that the students had to log in so we know who they were, and it logs all the attempts by time and so on. So I think overall we had 72 submissions to that form, but I think most of them were not actually needed because the students had already made a successful submission to Learn, and it was just them kind of being belt and braces and putting in an extra submission there just in case. But it was useful for a few students, I think, who had some technical problems with accessing Learn. So now we come to actually doing the marking. We had a month in which our exams were taking place from 27th of April to 27th of May. We were using these 3 different tools. So we used RM Assessor for one of our large exams. This is the 3rd year course that almost all our 3rd year students take. I'll come on to talk about RM Assessor in a minute. We also used Gradescope for some of our other larger exams, which were taking place in the middle of the diet. So that's actually 4 different courses, and the 2 with the kind of smaller bars is the same course, but there's different versions of the exam for the undergraduates and the postgraduates taking that course. So those were all courses with large enrolments. And then we're using this 3rd method for the rest of the courses, some of which were large, but most of which were quite small. So overall, there was quite a lot going on there. So that was 2,400 scripts that were being shuffled around. And I am grateful that the university cancelled the exams for 1st and 2nd year, because that would have increased that number massively. So Chris's Introduction to Linear Algebra course, for example, has 700 students. So that would really blow the numbers on this graph out of the water. So going through each of these tools in turn, we did choose to try out different tools here so that we could figure out maybe if we're going to be doing this more longer term, what works well. So we tried RM Assessor, which is a tool that's used by lots of large exam bodies, so the SQA in Scotland and the IB, and I think various A-level exam boards use it as well. So it is quite a robust platform. I'm not quite sure how much of it I meant to show you because of maybe confidentiality agreements and so on, but this is from their website, so you can see it's as you might expect, you've got the students' work on the left and some tools for assigning marks on the right-hand side. So we signed up with RM to do a proof of concept. So this wasn't their full service where I think we would have a server dedicated to our site. We were actually running on their kind of test server. So it really just was for trying this out with a single course to see if this was going to be a good fit. So the process within RM Assessor works with, you start off with what's called zoning, and that's where you mark up which questions are on which pages. Now, because our 1st and 2nd year exams were cancelled, we had a lot of PhD students who were expecting to have some marking work to do. So they would normally help us with doing the marking on those large exams. So as Stephen said, we got some help from them to give feedback to students on their submissions. In that practice run. We were also able to use some of their time to help with these aspects of getting the marking set up. So they were able to go through and mark up on each script where the different solutions were. And that then makes it much quicker when you come to do the marking, because you can zip through and do all the question 1As if you want to. So during the marking, question 1 was able to be split between 2 of those PhD students. So that was a question where there were 10 subparts where students were to generate an example. And the PhD students were able to quite clearly go off and say, yes, correct. Given a correct example, they've given the justification. And just put ticks next to those. The rest of the exam was marked by the lecturer. But because it had already been tagged up as to what parts were on what pages, he was able to go through and mark all the, I missed out question 2 there, actually. So he was marking questions 2 to 4. So he was able to go through and mark all of question 2, and then go through and mark all of question 3. And I think that does speed up the process. And then there was able to be a process of checking. So as the lecturer, he was able to go back and review the marking of the PhD students. Second tool we were using, Gradescope, has a kind of similar feature set. So the idea is, again, that you can split the marking up by question. It also adds in the feature of having rubrics by which you do the marking. So I'll talk about each of those in turn. We had a slight problem with the the splitting up exams, because we're kind of fitting into the way that Gradescope is set up, doesn't quite fit with our process. So they're imagining two different workflows. One is an exam where you know exactly where each of the answers is. So in the example that's on screen there from the Gradescope website, you know that the answer to question 1 is going to be roughly in that place where the green box is, because you've got a template for the exam that the students are writing on. So we're not exactly in that situation. And on the right is where the students themselves upload their work, and they do the process of saying, question 1 is on this page, question 2 is on that page. So we're kind of somewhere in between those, unfortunately, because we didn't want to have students going directly to Gradescope to upload their work. We wanted to make sure that they all had a consistent upload process. So it really needed to be us that was doing the uploading. So this was a bit of a thing to think about. Fortunately, one of my colleagues was able to kind of solve this process where we were able to do the uploading kind of manually on the student's behalf. So Colin Rundell, one of my colleagues, was able to automate this using R. So essentially just using the Gradescope website to upload each PDF in turn, but you just set off R to do that automatically. And then still we needed to go through and mark up which questions were on which pages. So again, we were able to use some PhD student time to help with that. The marking itself, it works with rubrics, and I'll show you some examples of that in a minute. So the general process that we used was that the lecturer, the course organizer for the course, developed that rubric, and then the marking team, which in some cases was maybe just 1 or 2 people, but in others we had quite a few PhD students working on it. They were able to go through and just apply that rubric for a given question. And then all the data is there, so the lecturer can go back and review the marking as well. So here's what Gradescope looks like. When you're doing the zoning, on the left, you've got the breakdown of questions by part. So if you were to click on to 2B, you're then able to click on to which pages have the answer to 2B on it. So that when the person's coming through to mark part 2B, they'll see all and only the relevant pages. When you're actually in the marking interface, so this is what, I'm not really able to show you our student work. I think it would be a bit unfair when we've not already released the marks to them to be showing it to other people. So this is just from Gradescope. So you've got the work on the left, and then on the right-hand side, the rubric that you're applying. So you can select as many of these items as apply. And you have a helpful overview of how the progress is going for each of the question parts as well. So one thing that was a bit of a thing we had to worry about, so it's not kind of the way that we normally do marking, is that the default setting here is to use negative marking with the rubrics. And we decided to go with that because I guess it's the default for a reason. And it does, I think, make a lot of sense to identify the error that's been made and give feedback on that error. So I think it means that at the end of this, although we're not trying to make the exams give useful feedback necessarily, the students will at least know where the mistake was if they were losing marks. So we were able to develop that rubric, and a nice thing with it is that you can tweak it as you go. So if it turns out that you've been overly harsh in taking off marks for one of these items, you can just type on this and change the mark allocation. So maybe we've been taking off 2 for that, and we've decided that's too harsh. I want to change it and make it -1. And that will apply retrospectively across all the items that have been tagged with that. You then, at the end of the process, get very helpful overview statistics. So we can see that 50% of the students were making this mistake. So that's kind of useful information for later teaching. Overall, I would say the feedback that we had from colleagues using this was very positive, and they found the rubrics quite easy to use once they got up and running. And certainly when they were doing the marking, they found it very fast. So we'd put in we kind of paid the cost of marking up the pages as to where each question was. But once that was done, it meant that the marking process does get very quick. And Gradescope themselves have done some research on this, and they seem to think that the marking gets kind of quicker over time. So as you get more used to the rubric, the amount of time that you spend on each script reduces as you mark more and more scripts. The third tool that we were using for most of the exams was very low tech. So this was just taking the PDFs that the students submitted and essentially getting colleagues to do their marking on those PDFs. the way that we did this was by adding forms to the PDFs. So the marks were communicated, and then we were able to extract those marks from forms and set them to script.
We're having a bit of trouble with your microphone, George.
So I can get sound on the microphone, if that's okay. Okay, is that better?
Yeah, that's much better.
Good. Sorry about that. I think when my laptop gets overexcited, the fan noise is not so good. Okay, so the idea here is that we're then able to read all the marks out into a spreadsheet nice and easily. So this is what the process looked like, designed by a colleague in our School of Engineering, Tim Drysdale. So he rapidly set about developing this, and that was kind of why I got into writing Go, because that was his programming language of choice. So on the right, you'll see the process that he was mapping out in engineering, but actually the process in maths was going to be slightly different. So I forked that project and made some changes to kind of suit our own process. So what our process looked like, we took the students' PDFs, ran it through this overlay script, which adds on the forms, and the output looks something like this. So down the right-hand side, we get a set of forms that we can then type in the marks. So just showing you in a bit more detail. So we needed to feed in for each of the papers exactly what the parts and marks breakdown was, and then that gives you a box just to type in the number of marks. So as a marker, you can go through with various PDF editing tools. So here is just an example of me using a sticky note to add a comment. We did also add, you can see the column of blue boxes. So those are form fields as well, where you can type in little notes if you're not able to leave sticky notes. Also, if you're using an iPad or another device with pen input, you can annotate the PDFs freely as well. And as I mentioned, we're able to then read out the marks that are typed into the form fields using a check marking code, which produces a spreadsheet. And this quite helpfully shows you the means for each part as you go, and also flags up various validation issues, like if you've typed in 5 marks out of 4 by mistake, or maybe you've allocated marks to a part on 2 different pages. It will flag up those sort of things for you to go back and review. And then at the end of the process, we take the PDFs and flatten them down so that any comments that you've left as sticky notes will be turned into footnotes, so that they can't then be edited. So that's when it goes off to the exam board at that point. We were using SharePoint to do moving around of all the files, and I think that worked quite well for us. Colleagues who were marking on iPad found that using the OneDrive app, it was very smooth for them to go from one PDF to the next. What I would say if you were doing this sort of approach is to test your PDF viewer, because they don't all support Acrobat Forms. And I was kind of terrified that we'd have a colleague who would go off and do all their marking and realize that we couldn't read out the marks. Fortunately, that didn't happen. So just kind of testing it out as you've done a few scripts will seem to be the way that we avoided that problem. The moderation process, I think the feedback that we've had on that is that colleagues enjoyed not having to do the adding up for themselves. So that definitely saved a lot of time that was not really usefully used on academics doing arithmetic. And at the exam board, I think the process went quite well. They found having those mark spreadsheets readily available was very helpful, and being able to electronically locate the borderline scripts that they needed to give special consideration, that was useful too. As to where we're going next with this, it's still a bit early to say definitively, but I think it is going to be growing in need. So we're going to be doing our remote exams in December again, if colleagues are still wanting to use exams in their courses. And I guess that will include all of the first and second year courses with large enrollments. So there's only going to be more stuff to be marking in this way. There may also be more use of midterms and other large in-course assessments. And we've also got the issue to think about if we tend to have weekly or fortnightly written work that's handed in. And so similar processes would be useful there, I think. Some issues that are in my head that we need to address in all this, obviously the way that we were doing the zoning, marking out which questions are on which page, was unsustainable to be paying PhD students to do that. So I think that's something that we will need to devolve to students in one way or another. So Gradescope, the students maybe would be uploading it themselves and marking up the questions for themselves. Or maybe this idea of mixing in stack questions with upload your working for question 4 here, which Chris has set up a demo of, which I think you can all access through the EAMS site. And we need to think about how we streamline this process of collecting submissions, dealing with late work and so on. And finally, making the process kind of smooth from the markers end. So I think Gradescope is quite a usable tool, actually. How can we replicate that in other tools if we're not going with Gradescope? And that's me.
Thanks, George. Thanks very much. So questions, please. If you have them for George and Stephen, let's have a quick look at the... So while colleagues type their questions in, Stephen, George...
I think Stephen's had to leave, unfortunately.
All right, so George then, which would you recommend? I mean, running 3 in parallel looks, you know, I mean, it was an experiment, wasn't it? We weren't sure which one. So which one should we go for in future, and why?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I've not fully thought through all the implications of all the different options, to be honest. Probably Gradescope is the front runner in my head in terms of the features that it has. But there are issues around how it integrates with other tools that we might be using. So I kind of see the merit of having it maybe sitting alongside our stack assessments that the students are used to doing during the course. But then it comes to, is it going to be as usable for markers? So, you know, maybe there are some things that we can be doing to make the marking process in the middle quiz a more kind of usable experience. I think that would be the kind of best of both worlds in my mind.
Yeah, and it sounded a little bit like the handling of the PDFs was on a wing and a prayer, really. I mean, it worked well, but that's not, you know, you talked about not sustainable and having PhDs zoning.
Yeah.
But we also, I think, would probably want to tighten up and automate some of those intermediate processes of handling files.
Yes, there was a lot of effort had to go into that, and I should also thank our colleague Carlos Abata-Caratala, who was doing a lot of the exam processing for us as well.
I mean, once that exam number is on a student script, you want to be absolutely sure that really is the right student script, don't you?
Yeah. Good.
So thank you, Debbie, for posting a question. Okay, there's more of a comment than a question. So there's a comment there about Gradescope. Students can zone on their own. Rubrics can be positive or negative, and so on. Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you, George. Thank you, Stephen, for presenting what you've done there. I mean, that was a lot of work to do 3 things in an emergency. And thank you for showing the options and the relative merits of that. Let's move on to the second speaker. Chris Graham, University of Newcastle, on a very similar topic. So over to you, Chris.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. And thank you, George and Stephen, for a fascinating talk. Unlike Edinburgh, we were required to assess our Stage 1 students. And so that is the topic of this talk. So I'm going to be talking about how we essentially use numbers as a platform to assess our entire Stage 1 program, pretty much our entire Stage 1 program in both our maths and physics Stage 1, Semester 2. So we talk a little bit about the background to this, how we went about putting together this project, how it went, and some thoughts for the future. So for those who don't know me, so Christian and I, we make up the main components of our school's e-learning unit. So that's the School of Maths, Stats and Physics. And we develop the numbers e-assessment software. I guess it's quite a unique setup in because we're there developing numbers, we also can offer significant support to our colleagues around school. So that makes this very different from a lot of other scenarios in that our module leaders themselves aren't usually involved with numbers heavily. So I will come back to that as I go through. At Newcastle, numbers is extensively used and embedded deeply into our learning and teaching. It's used across a broad range of subjects, some of those listed below, engineering, maths, chemistry, biomedical sciences. It has the full support of our university, and that means that we are involved in sort of all of the communications around digital tools that are offered. So, so if anybody's in Newcastle, for example, an email went out today about our move, upcoming move from Blackboard to Canvas, and there we were as one of the headline areas alongside the same level as things like Blackboard assignments with information about how to move across. So it's really embedded very significantly in Newcastle, and nowhere more so than our. Oh, I'll come back to our school. I'll first talk a little bit about numbers. So Mario this morning gave a very an excellent introduction to numbers, talked about some of its features. I'm not going to talk about a lot of those here, but one thing I will pick up on is it is very versatile, both in terms of the actual content of questions, but also in its delivery. So, so in the project I'm talking about today, we're talking about using our numbers LTI tool to record student attempts, but numbers can also be used standalone. Even here, just using an embed code to stick it right inside the slide. So very neat. It's flexible. This uses one of the versions from the latest release of numbers. This is awarded partial marks despite my forgetfulness about the constant of integration. So it's an incredibly flexible tool, and we use it in all sorts of applications as a result. Yeah, so nowhere more so than our own school, Maths, Stats and Physics, where numbers is a sort of part of a student's learning journey, if you like, through their degree program. So even the admission to our degree programs use numbers for pre-entry tests. We send out material to students before they arrive. When they arrive at the start of the degree program, they'll take some diagnostic tests and there's sort of supporting material to move them, aid their transition into university maths. There is a huge bank of practice material that is used to supplement the content of each module. and then for many modules, we use numbers for in-course assessments. So those are usually low stakes, bar a few in-class tests. So up until this year, we hadn't used numbers extensively for final exams, at least outside of service modules. And of course, until this year, for obvious reasons. And of course, where we had used numbers for high stakes final exams, it looked very different. So they would typically be situated in our university clusters, computer clusters, and use a lockdown browser, invigilated. So this was very difficult, very different, and posed some interesting challenges. So in mid-March, like many other places, we abandoned face-to-face contact with our students, and we moved to remote teaching. And as you'd be aware in other places, our university had to make decisions about what we would do in the assessment period that followed. And some very different choices were made, even to the previous speakers. So just picking out a few items from the guidelines, which are available online if you want to look at them. So no face-to-face invigilated exams was a no-brainer. The decision was made that all students should undergo some summative assessments to promote engagement. That was one of the main motivating factors. This third point was key, so that the assessments would be proportionate, thinking about both the marking load on staff and the burden on students. And this was a point I'll come back to, and one of the reasons that we ruled out 24-hour paper exams of a similar format to the ones that George and Stephen were just discussing. So the options given to us for our exams were a 24-hour take-home. So this was an exam paper released through our VLE. This would be an open book exam. Students could try it in their own time within the 24 hours, handwrite their solutions, and then upload it back to the VLE. We had nothing as sophisticated as George for the online marking, but similar format, I guess. Or the other option was what was called an alternative assessment. And this was quite flexible, to be fair, but it had to be coordinated by individual departments. So they had some autonomy about deadlines and format and things like that. So the numbers exams that I'm talking about today all fell into that latter category. So they were, strictly speaking, they were called alternative assessments. And we supported 14 of these assessments, all of which were in to do with stage 1 and foundation year. To give you a feel for the topics, so on the table there, that is our semester 2 stage 1 modules for our maths and physics degrees. So, so this was eight modules, but actually only 7 exams. One of them was co-taught. So a real mixture of subjects, some of them very challenging to move to an online format as well. On top of that, there were a number of other modules in various places around the university, engineering, natural sciences, and so on, where we were supporting numbers exams, mostly writing content or helping to coordinate the writing and content, but a couple just helping to support using our LTI tool. The areas on the right, the exams on the right, took very different formats. So some of these were 24-hour online exams, some with multiple attempts allowed, some where students would see the score at the end and have the opportunity to improve it. So what I'm going to do in the remainder of this talk is just talk about our school's own modules, so the ones on the left, for which we came up with a common format to use. So what were we thinking about when we were looking to come up with a format? Well, one of the main motivations was to ensure that students caught up with the material that they missed. So semester 2 had suffered from some quite significant disruption. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to get all students up to a standard where we felt that they would be able to succeed at stage 2. We wanted to minimize the impact. We've seen some of the strange things that can happen with technology from George's talk. So we want to minimize the impact of technical difficulties and also personal issues that students might have arising from the remote delivery of the assessments. So we're thinking about trying to be quite flexible in that sense. And we also wanted to avoid overly penalizing students because of an online format where mostly only final answers are marked, and things like those latest features around alternative answers, for example, missing the concept of integration, those weren't quite ready for us yet. So we wanted to think about being a little bit flexible there. Probably the most important consideration in deciding on a format for the assessments was that our stage 1 scores do not contribute to a student's degree classification. So with that in mind, we decided to go down the route of a pass-fail assessments using numbers. So for the 8 stage 1 modules that were in that table a couple of slides ago, the format was as follows. So these were delivered through using numbers. Each test would have a pass mark of 60%, so that's higher than the standard pass mark for these modules, which would be 40. We would allow unlimited attempts given to the students, and those attempts could be taken at any point through the exam period. So these assessments were open for the near 3 weeks of our May-June exam period. At the end of each attempt, they would see a score, so they'd know if they passed or failed at that point, and they'd see a mark breakdown. So this would tell them, which areas they didn't get correct, but not solutions, importantly. So they didn't get solutions at this point. So they would have to complete an attempt in its entirety without knowing how they'd done, finish their attempt, see the score and some indication of where they'd gone wrong. And then they would have the opportunity to take the assessment again if they had not passed. Because all of these modules had very high exam components, I think for almost all of them, they were 90% exam, 10% in-course assessments. The coursework marks were effectively discarded, and they've been retained to be taken into account for any borderline cases. As we'll see, actually, there were very few borderline cases, possibly because of the format. So we expected, we very much expected an extremely high rate of a pass rate here, given the sort of fairly relaxed nature of the assessment and plenty of time for students to catch up. But the key principle was that we had this quite high pass mark to encourage students to catch up on the material that they'd missed. This was quite a significant project. So overall, with around 14 exams in total, even on these 8 school modules that we had, that involved over 20 colleagues. So that's your module leaders, your module checkers, and some postgraduate students who helped us. So as you can imagine, a lot of that work was done on tools like Teams and Zoom to do things like training and using a lot of the collaborative features of numbers, where sort of conversation can be started and sort of flags put on questions to mark them as ready to use or need some attention. What did this look like? Well, so I've simplified this picture slightly because it was actually quite messy with the additional modules. Effectively, we had a module leader for each of these modules, effectively 7 of them because of the co-taught. And we employed some postgraduate researchers to effectively create content. And so those PGRs were distributed across the modules roughly according to their expertise. And the idea here was that the module leader would try to steer the content, give some an outline of what should be on the papers, and the postgraduate students with our assistants would create content. Following that writing phase, which lasted around 3 weeks, there's around two to 3 weeks actually of checking. So in this phase, we rotated the PGRs around the exams, so they were seeing seeing things with fresh eyes. And in fact, that rotation happened twice, I think, in the end. So we really had sort of quite a lot of eyes on the content. Of course, if you've sort of deployed assessment material before, you'll know that the only real way to test content is to give it out to 600 students and see what issues come back. And that would have been great if we'd been reusing material, but a lot of the material here was written specifically for these exams. So there was a lot of checking in this phase by the PGRs, by us, of course, and also by the module checkers. And they were given sort of one, they effectively checked one version of the randomized questions. So these multiple eyes on the content was really important. And finally, the module leader would give a final sign-off for their assessment and say they were happy to be used. And of course, throughout this, Christian and I were offering sort of training for PGRs and to some extent module leaders. We were actually stuck in with writing content for a couple of the more complicated modules, and finally involved in sort of deploying the tests. So quite a big project. That went quite well, that structure. I think we learned some things about how to go about this. So as I said, we have quite a large bank of existing material that is used for these modules, but we decided when we were thinking about what we wanted for these assessments to stay clear of reusing content the students had seen already. And we went down the path of taking the past exam papers from previous years and seeing just how much we could transfer to numbers. And the answer was quite a lot, actually. So we were thinking really about reusing exam questions. But in doing so, we had to consider a number of things. And Andre, last night, gave some interesting pointers on some of these considerations, actually. So things about the searchability of answers. So how easy is it to put a question into Wolfram Alpha and get a response? So, Andre pointed out some solutions, which are that you can reword your question slightly to try and prevent this, or ask for intermediate steps. And of course, there's a balance there behind scaffolding the question too much, you offering some guidance to the student, or do you just want the final answer? So there's a balancing act to be had there. Sharing of solutions. So we think that the randomization of the questions helped with this. So not only did we have variables inside questions randomized, but also the order of questions within the tests. So it was very difficult for a student to say, you know, my answer to question 4 was such and such. We made it as difficult as we possibly could. Multiple choice questions we found quite effective, particularly to cover that. So like I say, we're trying to cover quite a broad range of the module. And so we use these to give that opportunity to cover that range, but also to check deeper understanding of some questions. And we use quite a lot of variants. So somebody mentioned earlier in the conference about always, sometimes never type multiple choice questions, which are more effective than true false in some circumstances. Some of the content was challenging. I don't have time to in this talk to talk details, unfortunately, but some involved proofs. So that involved things like sort of gap type questions, where fill in the gaps for a proof. Others were computing with R, so we did that with sort of randomized data frames, things like that. So some of it was quite challenging, but we covered a large part of the exam papers that we started with. One thing, if you're going to do this in future, a suggestion from us is to specify in advance. So you have to remember that our module leaders didn't really have numbers experience. So when we asked them to come up with a sort of specification for what they wanted their assessment to look like, we didn't offer, I think, enough guidance about what we were looking for. So if we were doing this in future, we'd be much clearer about what we'd like from module leaders. So things like the wording of text, how it might be randomized, and that sort of thing. As well as the content preparation, there's quite a lot of technical preparation as well. So we use our numbers LTI tool for delivery. There's some mention of this in the talk this morning. For formative use, we plug it into Blackboard. For summative use, we actually plug it into a Moodle VLE. And then we have application that allows students to access this through a secure browser. So the secure browser prevents access to the web developer tools because Numbers is client side. This is important for security of the test. And during normal times, this would be accessed on a university cluster PC. So we'd have quite a lot of control actually around what sort of device students were accessing tests through. And of course, that wasn't the case. So normally they would access through a dedicated application just for us at Newcastle. And you should be familiar with this. It's the Moodle login. And then test themselves delivered through our LTI tool. So this is the instructor view of the LTI tool. Gives us the opportunity to review remark attempts and that sort of thing. So we needed to make some changes for this exam period. So rather than have students rely only on our remote application service, we released a version of the application that they could download on their own device, and that was quite successful. We made some changes to the LTI tool, including sending out receipts, and a number of changes to Numbers itself, including sort of relaxing the, being a little bit less strict on the syntax of input to prevent that sort of frustration for students, particularly if they've been marked down on the borderline because of it. So how did it go? Well, across all of those exams, our school and elsewhere, we had around 5,000 attempts from over 1,000 students, and actually close to half of those, maybe a third of those, were actually on the first day. There were very few issues with the content, so our approach to checking questions seemed to work quite well. We just had a few minor technical issues, including for our receipts. They didn't quite work out quite as well as we would have liked, and that's the thing for improvement next year. As you might expect, student performance was very high. The pass rate was high. The absent rate was very similar to previous years. What was promising was that students had to work to pass the assessments. So, so we'll see in a moment, less than half passed first time. So I think it did its job in that sense. One thing that was quite interesting was the approach that students took to trying the assessment. So, so each of the bars here is is one of our modules. The green, for those who can see green, is those who passed, and orange, those that were still in progress. So this was after the first day. Now, I must admit, I expected the vast majority of students to log in and have a look at every test, but that wasn't the case. So there's quite a bit went on the first day anyway. This was after a week, and I think we could have run this exam within a week, and students would have pushed through and completed. As it was, it went on. And this is at the exam end. You'll see what we end up with was very high pass marks across the board. Picking out one of those modules, this is one of our core maths modules. So this is distribution of scores from 2019 versus this year. You can see that we sort of pulled up those marks from between 20 and 60 upwards, but quite promising to see a decent spread across the higher marks there. This is the number of attempts students particular module, so just less than half passed it first time, and then there's a sort of half-life thing going on with each attempt, some taking many attempts to pass. I've sort of taken out here the trivial attempts where a student opened an attempt but didn't engage with it, just maybe to have a look at the questions. Okay, somewhere I've got a couple of minutes left. We have an embargo on our assessment survey going out this week. We have a survey at the moment out on perceptions with remote learning. So that's going out tomorrow, and we're interested in particular in their experiences compared to semester one, where they had written exams. I'd like to know how they prepared for these assessments and how confident they are moving into to stage 2 in the next academic year. There were a few quotes from the remote learning survey. They were largely positive, but I've picked out 2 at the extreme. So this student said they were a time waste, very easy to eventually pass. I'd argue that if it was that easy to eventually pass, can't have been that easy. Second one, this was really the sort of feedback we were hoping to, so that the test took away some of the stress because of the unlimited attempts, and that they had to work hard to get the pass mark. There were the usual comments about working out, that some would like marks for working out, and actually this last student took quite a mature approach and said actually that it pushed you to ensure that your answer was right because of that. So there's lots of evaluation, I think, still to do. Okay, so I'm going to pretty much finish there. So so what's next for us? I think just like George mentioned at the end of the last talk, growing needs, I think was his phrase. I can see us doing this again. I think it worked well, but we'd make some tweaks, I think, for next year, both in terms of, particularly probably in terms of the format about how long they'd be released for, but also we could consider breaking them up into smaller assessments, or even using specifications grading, as was seen last night. And that's it. Thanks very much for watching. Sorry, I've run over a touch, and thank you to everyone who's been involved with this project. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Chris. That's very interesting. One question in the chat asks, all the randomization and clever question types can't prevent the students from submitting their problems to an online cheating site and getting their expert answers. This is the biggest problem. Any ideas or solutions to that?
Yeah, we discussed this yesterday, didn't we? I think unless you go down the online proctoring route, this is an issue, and hopefully part of our evaluation will tell us how much of this went on. Yeah, I think for these stage 1 assessments, I think the students understood that they understood the format of the assessment. The point of it was for them to catch up. And actually, I had several emails afterwards saying, you know, can we have access to this material again to help us prepare for stage 2? I think they really saw it as much as a formative tool as a summative. Really, actually, it was a sort of jumping through the hoops exercise for them to pass through. But actually, they saw the benefit of taking part. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a perennial question for all of us, isn't it, really? I think.
Yeah.
More specifically about your approach to this, if I can ask. So Edinburgh appear to have just used their original exam papers rather than reformatting them for something like numbers, whereas you folks have reformatted your exams. So do you want to comment on why you made that decision and any consequences of that?
So we reformatted the exams in terms of moving them to numbers rather than written. Yeah.
So Edinburgh just sent out the exam papers as was, and the students took photos. I mean, that's a sort of design decision.
So so this was a lot about. So I guess from the burden on students' point of view, if we'd kept that long period that they were open for, I guess there would have been no harm in them writing their answers rather than submitting online. Benefits for us were largely around marking load. So these are significant size modules. We're talking 200 to 300 students in some of them. So there was a lot of benefit in that automated marking. But in addition, moving online give this opportunity for randomization that we wouldn't have otherwise had with paper exams. So with the long period that the exams would be open, we felt as though that randomization was a sort of key element to prevent sharing and looking up of answers and things.
Mm. Yeah, and did colleagues comment on that change in format? Was that an issue? Did you have that discussion in the department?
With module leaders, yeah. So so again, Andre was talking about this thing that we were consciously taking away some of that individual decision away from module leaders. And I think although we'd been allowed to do what we wanted at school level, we still needed agreement across our school about how we'd approach these things. I think the module leaders involved were very happy with not marking so many scripts. They saw it as a sensible solution. Yeah.
Can I ask, do you mind, Chris, if I ask George to come and answer the same question from the other perspective? Was there, why did Edinburgh send out the exam papers as is? Why didn't they use some automatic marking? And how did colleagues find all that? Hunting around for your microphone, George. Sorry.
Before George answers, what I will say, the other big factor was this was stage 1, and we didn't for stages 2 and 3. We wanted to see that working out, and ensure that we could both give those marks, but actually see the student actually writing maths. So yeah, and I'll let George.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that, George.
Yeah, I was going to pick up on that point because our exams were the 3rd and 4th year exams, and
right.
We did have a bit of conversation within the department about slight tweaks that you might make to the exam to have less of the kind of copy down the definition of this, which is more meaningful in an exam hall, but not so much when it's open book. So we made some small tweaks to the exams to suit the open book format, but I think coming up with a way of assessing things automatically at speed was not going to be possible, I think, for a lot of those courses.
Yeah. Thanks, George. Chris, we've got another question here in the Zoom chat saying, do you think the students repeating the assessments would be better prepared than usual for next year?
Repeating the assessments during the exam period, I presume, rather than, for example, the sit period.
Repeating the assessments.
Yeah, I think so. I think, I mean, you saw from the mark distribution, so it's essentially the content was not far off what the exam content was from the year before. It's obviously slightly different questions, but in terms of difficulty, it was very similar. So on the first attempt, you might very well imagine that students would be there in the 40s and 50s, especially given the gap in contact time that they've had this semester. So giving them the opportunity to try again, give them the opportunity to go away and scratch up on those questions that they didn't get correct, and so I think they probably did benefit from that. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I think we'll wrap up there. I just want to very quickly go back to the EAMS website, and if we go back to the EAMS 2020, I just want to point out some of the software demos that we have here. We've added some more from Soweso and Mobius today, so please do check those out. And thank you, Chris. Thank you, George and Stephen. Let's wrap up here, and I look forward to reconvening tomorrow morning for some further talks. Thanks, everyone.